Yeah, exactly.
All right, whenever you're ready, you may begin.
In his book, In his book, The Duty of a Statesman, William Lee Miller contended Lincoln's role in ending slavery was a moral accomplishment that required that he not admit it was such. The Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point in the fight against slavery. However, to be justifiable, the document was issued out of practical necessities rather than moral idealism. Thus, the document had limited success in actually freeing slaves, but succeeded in redefining the war for the greater support of the Union.
Despite the intent of the Emancipation Proclamation to free an entire class of people, its limited effectiveness when compared to other American documents of social reform lead us to disagree with Miller's use of Donnie Fehrenbacher's claim that the proclamation is the greatest document of social reform in American history. The effects of the proclamation were limited and did not apply to the border states. As a result, very few slaves were actually freed by the measure, prompting historian Lonnie Bunch to call it the most misunderstood document in American history.
Comparatively, in providing true emancipation, citizenship, basic due process rights, equal protection rights, and universal male suffrage, the Reconstruction Amendments had a greater influence. Similarly, the Declaration of Independence incited a social and political revolution, resulting in the creation of the United States itself. Though it acted as a catalyst for later, more successful attempts to eradicate slavery, the results of the proclamation were not significant enough for it to be considered the greatest example of social reform in the history of the United States.
Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles described President Lincoln's insistence that as a military necessity, we must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued. While Lincoln had previously deemed such a measure unconstitutional, he now embraced it as a necessary means of saving the Union. To justify his action, Lincoln rooted the proclamation in his power as commander-in-chief by describing it as an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. Before the proclamation, the war had simply been one to preserve the Union, but Lincoln found that he had to redefine the conflict for international support.
Further justification for the order was also found in Lincoln's powers as chief executive to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, giving Lincoln the ability to enforce legislation like the 1861 and 1862 Confiscation Acts. Furthermore, the Supreme Court vindicated Lincoln's proclamation in the 1952 Youngstown Sheet and Two Company decision when it differentiated between Lincoln's actions as commander-in-chief and President Harry Truman's unconstitutional executive order to nationalize the steel industry.
Despite hardly freeing any slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation still had significant repercussions for American constitutionalism. Many saw the uncompensated taking of private property by the President as a clear violation of the Fifth Amendment Takings Clause, or in the opinion of historian R.R. Palmer, as an annihilation of individual property rights without parallel in the history of the Western world. However, in the period before the proclamation, a number of offers to compensate slave owners who abandoned the rebellion were made. The proclamation itself even said that those who remain loyal shall be compensated for all losses, including slaves.
The Captures Clause of the Constitution further justified the Emancipation Proclamation, in that it allowed Congress to make rules concerning captures on land. Since the Confiscation Acts and subsequent proclamations were wartime measures, the uncompensated taking of rebel property was justifiable under this clause. Furthermore, the Confederate States' rejection of the Constitution meant that the Fifth Amendment no longer applied to them, a fact reflected by President Lincoln's statement that such principles apply only in this country and not to those in rebellion against the Constitution.
Lincoln acknowledged the flaws of the proclamation when he found that it fell far short of what the 13th Amendment will do when fully consummated. The true idealism of the proclamation would not be fully revealed until the permanent death of slavery by the 13th Amendment and the assurance of a new birth of freedom that is provided. Thank you.
Isn't President Lincoln talking out of both sides of his beard when he says that the Fifth Amendment no longer applies to the Confederacy because they've rejected the Constitution, but he's also stated that they're still part of this country, they're just in rebellion? Isn't that hypocritical to say that?
Well, that's central, really, to the crisis of the Civil War. There had to be a lot of, I want to call it finagling on his part to ensure that acts like the Emancipation Proclamation were justifiable. So he basically had to assume, along with the Emancipation Proclamation, that slaves were indeed property that could be confiscated in the Captures Clause, when everyone really knows that people can't be property.
Well, that wasn't my question, though. My question wasn't about the slavery. My question was about the status of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Was it or was it not a foreign country?
It wasn't, and the way that Lincoln defined it was very unique in that it not only allowed him to take the Constitution away from them as a means of maintaining rights, but it also allowed him to avoid treating them as a foreign nation. Because Lincoln really treated them as an area of conflict or an area of insurrection rather than a foreign entity, he was able to suspend the rights that were provided by the Constitution, while at the same time avoiding declaring them as a foreign entity altogether.
Additionally, Abraham Lincoln freed the Southern slaves for this idea of if the Union was actually violating the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment, there was no way that the Union would be able to pay for just compensation of the slaves.
Let's talk about the aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation. What were some of the effects of this document on the war effort in the Union Army and the Confederate Army and the sunset of the Civil War?
Unfortunately, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't have as big of an impact as we'd originally think, because it only freed the slaves in the Southern Territory. Those that still existed on the border states were left still enslaved. So it really didn't allow the government to free as many enslaved people as it originally intended to.
But you can also look at it in the sense of it being a rally point almost. General Benjamin Butler, who was stationed in Virginia, stated that he was a Northern Democrat and he defended slave owning. But since he was in charge of the African military that then were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, he had a change of heart because he was able to work with the African Americans, and he was then able to see the morality and the necessity of universal emancipation.
In a letter to Horace Greeley, Lincoln actually said that if he could preserve the Union without freeing a single slave, he would do so. And if he could do the same by freeing all the slaves, he would also do so. So with the Emancipation Proclamation, what he was really trying to do was redefine the war effort. He was just looking for that necessity. He needed that cause, as my colleague Christina said, to ensure the success of the war, not only domestically, but also internationally. He had to make sure that the Confederacy wasn't recognized by foreign nations.
Wasn't that just a trial balloon, though? Wasn't Lincoln just trying to gather the support for the war effort of the Copperhead Democrats in New York?
Wait, what was the question? Sorry.
This idea, when he said this letter to Horace Greeley, which was published in it was a New York Herald, which is a Copperhead Democratic newspaper in New York. Wasn't he just simply trying to gather their support? Wasn't that like the same thing as a presidential candidate today going to one group and saying one thing and going to another group and saying a completely different thing?
Well, the funny thing about that letter is he had actually already written the Emancipation Proclamation at that point. So it was almost him trying to soften the blow for the people who opposed the proclamation. It wasn't, I mean, sure, it was a campaign point, but at the same time, it was also him saying that he was just doing what was necessary for the Union.
I just got the privilege of seeing Lincoln finally last weekend. And I was really surprised that the movie was made about what it was made about, because people thought it was the Civil War. And I've also visited many Civil War battlefields and done a lot of research on this. But as a middle school teacher, we don't get into what you get into like this. But we did always talk about, do you think that slavery would have eventually ended? Or did it take the war? What do you think about that concept? And I ask this to my 8th graders all the time.
The war was necessary primarily because of the Supreme Court decision of Dred Scott v. Sandford. Because Dred Scott defined African Americans as not being citizens of the United States, there was no real way to really undefine that unless it was through constitutional amendment. And because the South was never going to ratify an amendment that was redefining African Americans as citizens that deserved rights, the war was very uniquely necessary.
In his 1822 autobiography, Thomas Jefferson actually said that nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than the death of slavery. So this shows even the founding father believed that slavery was eventually, well, it was on the down slope. So basically, throughout the 19th century, what you see is a group of compromises that essentially keep slavery going, and along with the Dred Scott decision.
This Clause 11 very clearly says that Congress is empowered to make rules concerning captures on land and water. Did Congress act or not act in a way that would allow Lincoln to define how, through the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union would capture, quote unquote, slaves?
Well, in many ways, the Confiscation Acts of 1861 and 1862 were precursors to the Emancipation Proclamation itself. They weren't as notable in many ways because they didn't have as much of an effect. Even the Emancipation Proclamation didn't have an effect. But the Emancipation Proclamation could be seen as enforcing those pieces of legislation.
We'll stop there.